Hey everyone, tonight we're taking a trip back in time to ancient Rome, but not to celebrate their victories or dive into their politics. We're going to explore a darker, more unsettling side of their world. While Rome is famous for its roads, aqueducts, and legal systems, it also came up with some of the most bizarre, theatrical, and frankly disturbing punishments ever seen in the ancient world. So, before you get too comfortable, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy the content I create. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see the global audience that joins us. Now, let's dim the lights and maybe turn on a fan for a bit of background noise as we begin our journey. Vestal virgins buried alive. That was the high price of virginity. In ancient Rome, the Vestal virgins were kind of like the spiritual equivalent of national Wi-Fi. If they went down, everything went haywire. These women were carefully chosen before they even hit puberty to serve the goddess Vesta, who was the keeper of the eternal flame. Their main gig was to keep that sacred fire burning, and even more importantly, to stay away from men for a solid 30 years. Now, breaking a vow of chastity in ancient Rome wasn't just a minor offense. It was considered to be on par with setting off a nuclear bomb in the middle of the Senate. If a Vestal virgin was caught having an affair, the punishment was literally being buried alive. Yes, I mean actually alive. Not metaphorically cancelled, not sent to time out, but straight up entombed underground. Why bury her instead of just executing her with a sword like they did with regular criminals? Simple. The Romans believed that you couldn't spill a Vestal's blood without offending the gods. So they found a clever loophole. They would dig a pit, lower her into it with a barely flickering oil lamp, a little bit of bread, and a jug of water. Because hydration is important. Then they sealed her in. Voila. No blood, no mess, and no angry deities. The poor woman would just lie there in the darkness, contemplating her life choices while Rome brushed its hands off and moved on. You might think that the guys she was caught with would suffer the same fate, but no, they usually just got whipped to death in public. Still brutal, but at least it was quicker. To be fair, becoming a Vestal was a huge honor. You got front row seats at all the games, traveled in fancy carriages, and even had the power to pardon condemned prisoners with just a single word. But all of that came with one tiny little catch. Mess up even once, and you're sleeping underground for eternity. And yes, Rome took it that seriously. One famous Vestal, Cornelia, was accused during Emperor Domitian's reign. Before being sentenced, she reportedly shouted, "Does Caesar think I've been intimate with a god then? Because no mortal man has ever touched me." A bold move, for sure, but it didn't work. So, if you're ever feeling stressed out by your job, just remember that at least your boss isn't threatening to bury you alive in a hole with stale bread and a dusty old oil lamp. Rome, where HR policies were etched in stone and enforced with fear. Pena culiae, death in a sack with animal roommates. Ancient Rome, the birthplace of philosophy, architecture, and punishments that sound like something out of a bizarre fever dream. Let's talk about pena culiae, which translates to penalty of the sack. And no, this isn't some weird medieval game show. It's what happened if you committed the ultimate Roman taboo, killing your own father. Romans didn't just give you a slap on the wrist with a fine or throw you in jail. No. If you murdered dear old dad, they gave you the deluxe punishment package starring you and 4 very unfortunate animals. First, the Romans would tie your hands, maybe give you a moment to reflect on your life choices. Spoiler alert, you definitely made some bad ones. Then they'd sew you up inside a large leather sack. Sounds cozy, right? But it gets so much better. Joining you in the sack were a dog, symbolizing the loyalty you lacked. A monkey, because why not add some pure chaos? A snake, to slither through all your regrets. And a rooster, perhaps there to announce your impending doom at sunrise. Then the sack, now overflowing with bad decisions and animal rage, was hurled into a river, ideally a really deep one. The result was a flailing, yelping, screeching, hissing blender of pure panic and poetic justice. Nobody really knows for sure why these specific animals were chosen, but historians think it was symbolic. Dogs represented family, monkeys chaos, snakes deceit, and roosters vigilance. Basically, They were your sins made flesh and feathers. Can you even imagine the scene inside that sack? You're getting headbutt by a monkey while a snake is coiling around your leg. The dog is losing its mind, and the rooster thinks it's just another Tuesday morning. If this sounds like the worst escape room imaginable, you're not too far off. Thankfully, the punishment was rare. But Rome brought it back every now and then just to make a point, usually under emperors who were huge fans of the theatrical. It wasn't just about killing the criminal. It was about making a big statement and maybe traumatizing a few spectators in the process. So, next time your dad tells a corny joke or forgets your birthday, just be grateful you weren't born in Rome. Back then, patricide didn't mean therapy. It meant sack time with the serpent circus. Crucifixion. But upside down, flipping the script on suffering. When we hear the word crucifixion, most of us immediately think of one thing: a wooden cross, a slow, agonizing death, and a very clear warning to anyone watching not to mess with the state. It was Rome's signature punishment, brutal, public, and intended to be incredibly humiliating. But leave it to the Romans to occasionally add their own little creative twist. Enter the inverted crucifixion. Yes, upside down. Because apparently dying upright just wasn't humiliating enough. This method was typically reserved for special cases, usually people the authorities really wanted to make an example of. Criminals, traitors, and those rebels who insisted on causing trouble even as they died. Perhaps the most famous upside-down crucifixion was that of St. Peter, one of Jesus' 12 apostles. According to tradition, when Peter was sentenced to die by crucifixion under Emperor Nero, he made a rather unusual request: "Crucify me upside down. I'm not worthy to die in the same manner as my Lord." And Rome, being the ruthlessly efficient machine that it was, said, "Sure, why not?" Now, here's where things get seriously intense. Crucifixion was already one of the worst ways to die, combining asphyxiation, blood loss, and total public humiliation. But flipping the body upside down completely changed the dynamics. Blood rushed to the head, muscles strained in unnatural ways, breathing became nearly impossible, and the pain was amplified significantly. Think of it like this. It's the difference between sitting through a boring lecture and sitting through that exact same lecture upside down while someone drives nails into your ankles. Not exactly the same vibe, right? But this wasn't just about physical suffering. It was also about symbolism. The inverted cross became, ironically, a symbol of humility. Peter's choice was meant to show reverence, not defiance. Unfortunately, that image was later co-opted by horror movies and heavy metal bands, giving it a very different PR spin. The Romans, however, didn't care much about the symbolism. For them, it was all about sending a clear message. Cross us, and we'll make your death as weird and memorable as humanly possible. So, the next time you're hanging out, hopefully not literally, remember that ancient Rome could turn any punishment into a truly disturbing piece of performance art. Upside-down crucifixion wasn't just death. It was death with dramatic flair. Decimation. The original team-building exercise with a twist of trauma. When you think of a motivational speech, you probably imagine a coach yelling, "We win together. We lose together." But in ancient Rome, that phrase could easily have been, "We march together, or 1 in 10 of you dies." Welcome to the absolutely charming world of decimation. A military punishment so brutal it makes modern boot camp look like a relaxing spa day. Here's how it worked. If a Roman unit showed cowardice in battle, attempted to desert, or even mutinied, the commander had a pretty extreme option at his disposal. Not in the explosive sense, but more in the psychological warfare sense. The entire group would be lined up, and every 10th soldier would draw lots. The unlucky one? He got beaten to death by his 9 comrades using clubs, stones, or whatever else was handy. Yes, you heard that correctly. Not only did you face death yourself, but you also had to kill your buddy. The guy you probably shared wine and bread with the night before, all to prove your loyalty to Rome. It was like Survivor, Roman Legion edition. Except nobody won immunity, and everyone left deeply traumatized. And don't assume that the 9 survivors got a break afterward. They didn't get high fives and a long weekend. Nope. They were given barley instead of wheat for rations, which was the Roman way of saying, "We're incredibly disappointed in you, and they were forced to camp outside the safety of the fort. The logic behind decimation was cold but undeniably effective. If you feared your own comrades more than you feared the enemy, you'd think twice before running away. And strangely enough, it actually worked. Roman discipline was legendary, and decimation kept soldiers marching in line, even if they had to step over a few bodies to do it. One of the most infamous uses of decimation was by Crassus, the wealthy general who formed the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey. After a humiliating defeat in the Spartacus slave revolt, he decimated a disgraced unit. Because nothing says we're back on track, quite like a casual in-house massacre. So, next time your boss says, we need to boost team accountability, just be thankful you're not living under Crassus. In Rome, failure wasn't just punished. It was distributed. The fork of heretics, a medieval neck workout nobody asked for. Let's say you lived in ancient Rome, or more accurately, the later Roman Empire, during those twilight centuries when things got weirder, darker, and way more obsessed with heresy. You spoke out against the church, or maybe you challenged some sacred belief. Rome didn't just scold you. Oh no, they gifted you an accessory you'd never forget. The fork of heretics. Picture this. A metal rod with two prongs at each end. One end pointed upward under your chin. The other jammed right into your upper chest. It was basically a miniature trident sandwiching your neck. Sounds uncomfortable, right? Well, we're just getting started. Once this lovely device was strapped on, you were absolutely forbidden to move your head at all. Look down, stabbed. Look up, stabbed. Try to whisper a heretical thought to the person next to you, stabbed by your own collar. The brilliance of this device was that it didn't draw blood. At least not at first. The fork wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to exhaust you, mentally, physically, and spiritually. You'd be left standing, sometimes for days, straining every single muscle just to avoid impaling yourself. It was like playing a bizarre game of don't move, where the prize was not slowly skewering your own throat. And while we call it the fork of heretics, it was also used on blasphemers, suspected witches, suspected liars, and pretty much anyone who annoyed a bishop before his morning coffee. It was a versatile form of torture, custom fit for silence, stillness, and soul-crushing discomfort. To make things even more theatrical, the fork sometimes had little Latin inscriptions engraved on it, things like, I renounce my sin, or I am guilty, because nothing enhances your confession quite like being slowly impaled by typography. What's truly wild is that this punishment wasn't even one of Rome's most extreme. It was more of a starter pack for sinners. No blood, no public execution, just quiet suffering and internal panic. It was a sort of introductory course in Agony Heresy 101. So, if you've ever tried to hold in a sneeze during a really serious meeting, imagine doing that for 3 days straight with iron prongs poking at your throat. In Rome, silence wasn't golden. It was enforced with 2 rusty prongs and a neck cramp sent from the gods themselves. Thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, Rome's original unfriend button. Forget passive-aggressive texts or dramatic social media unfollows. In ancient Rome, if you betrayed the state, they didn't just cut you off, they threw you off a cliff. Welcome to the Tarpeian Rock, a jagged, 80-foot drop on the southern face of the Capitoline Hill, located just a short stroll from the Roman Forum. It wasn't just a scenic viewpoint. It was where the Republic took out the trash by launching traitors straight off of it. And yes, it was just as theatrical as it sounds. The rock gets its name from Tarpeia, a Roman girl who betrayed the city to the enemy Sabines in exchange for what she thought would be shiny gold bracelets. The Sabines, ever the literal thinkers, crushed her with their shields instead, technically fulfilling the deal. Her body was tossed from the cliff, and the rock was named in her honor. The moral of the story? Don't trust invaders, and don't accept vague payment plans. After that incident, the Tarpeian Rock became Rome's favorite tool for dealing with traitors, corrupt officials, false witnesses, and anyone else who made the state say, yeah, this one needs some dramatic punishment. No hanging, no sword, just a short flight and a sudden, bone-shattering stop. The condemned were often stripped naked, paraded through the streets, and then marched to the edge, where gravity handled the sentencing. And yes, there was usually a large crowd. Nothing like a good old-fashioned execution to spice up market day. It was public. It was final. And it was deeply symbolic. You weren't just dying. You were being physically and spiritually removed from the city. It was the ultimate cancel culture Roman edition. Interestingly enough, the rock sat just a stone's throw away from the Temple of Jupiter, which meant that if you lied to the gods or the state, your final moments included a brief, front-row view of heaven. Over time, more elaborate punishments came along: lions, crucifixions, burning tunics. But the Tarpeian rock remained a classic. It was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its message. So, the next time someone says they really threw him under the bus, remind them that the Romans did it first. No wheels needed, just stone and the sound of betrayal echoing through the hills. Damnatio ad bestias. Death by lion, applause optional. Welcome to the Colosseum. Stone, sweat, and 50,000 roaring fans. It was ancient Rome's version of cable TV. Today's main event? Damnatio ad bestias, or as we might call it, being fed to wild animals while everyone eats snacks. This punishment, meaning condemnation to the beasts, was Rome's go-to method for dealing with criminals, traitors, prisoners of war, and most tragically, Christians who refused to bow down to the imperial gods. And make no mistake, this wasn't just about death. It was about the spectacle. Rome didn't believe in boring executions. They believed in theater. The condemned were thrown into the arena, where hungry lions, leopards, bears, or sometimes even elephants were waiting. But here's the real twist. Rome being Rome, they often dressed the victims up first. That's right, they turned their deaths into morality plays. One unlucky soul might be dressed as Orpheus, only to be mauled mid-lyre solo. Another might play a mythological villain like Prometheus, only to have birds peck at him in a disturbingly accurate reenactment. It was entertainment, justice, and religious propaganda all rolled into one fur-covered disaster. You might ask, did they even have a chance to defend themselves? Absolutely not. This wasn't a trial. This was a death sentence wrapped in applause. The crowd came to see blood, and if the lions happened to be feeling sleepy that day, no problem. The Romans had a few tricks up their sleeves, like poking them with hot irons or starving them for a couple of days beforehand. The show must go on. And remember, this wasn't limited to hardened criminals. You could end up in the arena for petty theft, political dissent, or even for being on the wrong side of religious law. The only thing standing between you and lion lunch was a show of favor from a very generous emperor. But don't get the wrong idea. This wasn't just pure sadism. It was carefully calculated, a warning to anyone watching. Step out of line, and this could be you. Rome ruled by fear and felines. In time, Christian martyrs flipped the script, turning death by beasts into a badge of honor. But for most, damnatio ad bestias was less about glory and much more about gore. So, the next time you grumble about jury duty, be thankful it doesn't involve dressing up as a myth and dodging ravenous leopards. Forced suicide with honor. When Rome let you die with dignity. Believe it or not, in ancient Rome, getting a death sentence didn't always mean being dragged to the arena or tossed off a cliff. Sometimes, if you were lucky, or rather, politically connected, you got a special kind of punishment, forced suicide. Sounds contradictory, doesn't it? We're not going to kill you, but we strongly suggest you do it yourself. Here's how it worked. If you were a senator, a noble, or just someone high enough in Roman society to own more than one tunic, and you managed to deeply offend the emperor, maybe by plotting a coup, or maybe just by existing too confidently, you'd receive a discreet visit. A scroll would be delivered, a polite message from the emperor, and it would go something like this. You have dishonored the state. Please take the honorable route out. Translation. Kill yourself by sunset, or we'll do it for you and make it really, really nasty. The upside? If you complied, your family got to keep your property, and your name might even be left unblemished in the historical records. Maybe it was the Roman version of a severance package, only with blood instead of paperwork. This wasn't considered a humiliation. It was viewed as noble. In fact, many elites saw it as a final act of control, a chance to write their own ending, sometimes literally. Think warm bath, a blade to the wrist, and a final monologue. very on-brand for Rome's love of drama. The philosopher Seneca the Younger famously faced this fate. Accused of being part of a conspiracy against Nero, possibly falsely, he was told to end things himself. He slit his wrists, then his ankles, but the bleeding was too slow, so he drank poison. That didn't work either. Finally, he climbed into a hot bath to speed things up. It was less a suicide and more of a grim chemistry experiment. Forced suicide was essentially state-sanctioned dignity, a facade of choice masking absolute power. Rome gave you the illusion of honor while ensuring that you were quietly erased, without a trial, without a crowd, just the hiss of warm water and the silence of complicity. So, if you've ever thought your boss was passive-aggressive, imagine being formally invited to self-destruct by imperial courier. Rome didn't always kill you. Sometimes they just let you do it beautifully. The wooden donkey, when sitting became a crime. If you've ever complained about an uncomfortable chair, ancient Rome would like to have a word. Because one of their more imaginative punishments involved a piece of furniture. The now infamous wooden donkey, or as it should have been called, the pain pony of doom. This device wasn't an actual donkey, of course. It was a tall, narrow, sharply angled wooden beam shaped like an A-frame with a razor-thin peak. The condemned, usually thieves, slaves, or rebellious soldiers, were forced to straddle it. That's right, their entire body weight pressed down on that sharp edge, right between the legs. But wait, it gets even worse. To really drive the point home, pun absolutely intended, weights were often tied to the person's ankles. Gravity did the rest. The longer you sat, the more the beam tore into your flesh, slowly, painfully, and depending on how generous the executioner was feeling, you might be left there for hours. Now, the Romans didn't invent the wooden donkey. It likely came from earlier Middle Eastern torture traditions. But oh, did they embrace it with flair? Because if there was one thing Rome loved, it was punishment with pageantry. This wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it was just used as a very persuasive form of public humiliation. Picture it. A crowded town square, a merchant caught cheating his customers now wailing atop the donkey, while kids laughed and vendors sold snacks. It was pain, performance art, and a life lesson all in one. Even worse, Roman generals sometimes used it as a form of field discipline. Soldiers who disobeyed orders could find themselves straddling the donkey as a reminder to follow the rules. Because nothing boosts morale quite like internal bleeding. And yes, there were occasional modifications. Some donkeys were made of metal, some had spikes. One record even mentions a heated version, because apparently Rome was taking feedback and innovating on the fly. It was humiliating, it was brutal, and it turned the simple act of sitting into a punishment that could scar you for life, physically and mentally. So, the next time your office chair feels a bit stiff, just remember that at least it's not a sharp triangle, and no one is tying rocks to your feet. In ancient Rome, bad posture wasn't your biggest problem. The furniture was. Branding the face, when your mugshot was permanent. In a world without ID cards, background checks, or Google searches, ancient Rome had a pretty simple solution for keeping track of criminals. Just burn it onto their face. Yes, we're talking about branding, not the kind companies do with logos, but the kind where your actual forehead becomes a crime label. And if you were a thief, a runaway slave, or a repeat offender, congratulations. You now had a permanent facial feature that screamed, "Do not trust this guy." The branding was usually done with a heated metal rod pressed into the skin with the gentle mercy of a blacksmith on a deadline. Letters like F for fur, thief, or C for calumnia, false accuser, were seared onto your forehead or cheek. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of a one-star Yelp review, but etched onto your skull. And this wasn't done in some private back room. Oh no, branding was public, a spectacle, a lesson. The idea was to humiliate the criminal so that others would think twice. It wasn't just punishment. It was propaganda sizzling straight into your flesh. Now imagine living with that mark. Walking through the market, everyone knows what you did. Trying to get a job? Good luck. Flirting with someone? Forget it. You weren't a person anymore. You were a walking crime scene. Runaway slaves were especially targeted. Many were branded with the letters FUG, short for fugitivus, meaning escapee. And if they ran again after that, harsher branding or worse awaited them. Slaves weren't just property. They were expected to wear their disobedience like a badge. Some clever folks tried to remove or disguise the marks through cuts, tattoos, or even makeup. But Rome, ever prepared, made those acts punishable too. Tampering with your brand was like trying to Photoshop your criminal record. It didn't fly. Later, emperors like Constantine tried to tone things down, suggesting that brands be placed on the hands or legs instead of the face. But even then, the point remained the same: permanent shame. So, the next time someone tells you to face the consequences, just be glad they don't mean that literally. Because in ancient Rome, they didn't just remember your crime. They made sure your face did too. Tongue removal for blasphemy. Say goodbye to small talk. In ancient Rome, freedom of speech came with a pretty big asterisk. You could praise the emperor, debate philosophy, and recite poetry, but just don't blaspheme. Because if you badmouthed the gods, insulted the emperor, or whispered the wrong words in the wrong ears, you might find yourself on the receiving end of a punishment that was both incredibly literal and absolutely horrifying. Tongue removal. Yes, they really did it. The logic was simple. If your words were dangerous, Rome would silence you permanently. The process wasn't exactly subtle. There was no anesthesia, no sterile tools, just forceps, iron, and excruciating pain. A soldier or executioner would clamp your tongue, slice it off, or in some cases rip it out entirely. It wasn't surgery. It was state-approved censorship. And it wasn't always about religion. Sure, blaspheming against the gods was a fast track to punishment, especially if you mocked Jupiter in public or questioned the sacred fires. But often, blasphemy, speaking out against the emperor or the empire's moral code, was a dangerous game. Basically, if your words made those in power uncomfortable, you suddenly found yourself in a medical crisis. One bad joke, a whispered heresy, or a rebellious song, and snip. This wasn't just a brutal punishment. It was a spectacle. Public tongue removals sent a clear message. Words are powerful, but our words are more powerful. And even if you survived, life afterward was no walk in the park. Clear speech was impossible. Arguing your innocence? Forget about it. Even screaming properly was off the table. It was isolation achieved through mutilation. A scarlet letter carved not into your skin, but into your silence. Ironically, some of the earliest Christian martyrs met this very end. They refused to abandon their faith and kept preaching, so Rome decided to silence their ideas by silencing the messengers themselves, literally. Of course, the Christians then transformed these stories into tales of divine courage, which only enraged the Romans further. If this sounds extreme, remember that Rome was obsessed with control. And what better way to control someone than by silencing them completely? So, the next time someone tells you to hold your tongue, be grateful it's just a saying. In ancient Rome, they meant it quite literally. Breaking on the wheel, where your bones became art. If you thought the Romans were running out of creative ways to destroy a person, let me introduce you to the wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, or, for those with a flair for the dramatic, the Catherine wheel, named later in the medieval period. It wasn't so much an execution as it was a macabre sculpting session, with the human body serving as the raw material. Here's how it went down. First, the condemned person was tied to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs spread out like some kind of grotesque human starfish. Then, an executioner, armed with a heavy iron bar, would begin the real work, slowly and deliberately smashing the limbs, one by one. The goal wasn't a quick kill, oh no. The point was to shatter the bones while keeping the victim alive for as long as possible. Arms snapped, thighs crushed, ankles twisted beyond recognition. The body would contort unnaturally, becoming a horrifying display of pain and precision. But the piece de resistance? The broken body was then woven through the wheel's spokes, limbs bent and threaded like some nightmare craft project. Sometimes the wheel was hoisted up on a pole, like a warning flag. Other times, it was left to spin gently in the wind, because why not add some ambience? This wasn't just about punishment. It was a public service announcement. Breaking on the wheel was reserved for crimes considered especially heinous. Murder, treason, highway robbery. It screamed to the crowd, This is what happens when you cross the line. And you won't just die, you'll rot in full view. Survivors were rare. But here's the twisted kicker. If someone somehow survived the ordeal, say they were still breathing after a day or two, they might be shown mercy with a final blow to the chest or neck. As horrifying as it sounds, this punishment outlived Rome. Medieval Europe loved it so much they turned it into an art form, adding spikes, fires, and dramatic scripts. Rome had merely set the stage. So, the next time you think your commute is rough, remember at least you're not strapped to a wooden wheel, becoming the centerpiece of a public bone gallery. In Rome, justice wasn't blind. It was bold, brutal, and designed for maximum exposure. Execution by hot ash. Death by the grainy, slow burn. When it came to creative killing, ancient Rome always had something simmering, literally. Enter one of its lesser-known, but deeply disturbing punishments, execution by hot ash. It's not as famous as crucifixion or being fed to the lions, but it just might be one of the slowest and most psychologically terrifying ways to die ever conceived. No swords, no bloodshed, no quick release, just ashes, heated, suffocating, and endless. This gruesome method is credited, unsurprisingly, to Emperor Nero, a man who treated executions like performance art. In one recorded instance, Nero had an enemy buried up to his neck in a pit. So far, classic Rome. But instead of beheading or stoning him, Nero added a special touch. A funnel was inserted into the man's mouth, and hot ash was slowly poured in. Not boiling water, not fire, ash. At first glance, it seems harmless. Ashes are soft, right? But that's where the diabolical genius kicks in. The ash is scorching. It clogs the throat, sears the lungs, and suffocates from the inside out. It doesn't kill quickly. Chokes slowly, gradually. You feel every moment, every breath turning to fire, every swallow becoming your last. As the ash settles, you're not bleeding, not burned on the outside, but inside, everything is failing. It's death by dust, death by suffocation disguised as silence. Why ash, though? Because it was humiliating, undignified. Ashes were the remnants of destruction, used to clean filth, to wipe away traces of things burned. To die in ash was symbolic. It meant you were beneath notice, unworthy of steel or flame. You weren't even worth a dramatic death, just the slow grind of what was left over. It's worth noting that this punishment wasn't common. It was reserved for those Nero really didn't like, people whose very existence he wanted erased quietly, yet with maximum psychological torment. To the crowd, it didn't look like much. No blood, no screams, just a man in a hole and a trickle of gray dust. So, the next time someone tells you ashes to ashes, dust to dust, remember that in Nero's Rome that wasn't just poetry, it was protocol. The tunica molesta, Rome's deadliest wardrobe malfunction. In ancient Rome, fashion didn't kill unless you were wearing the tunica molesta, or as we might call it, the flammable death robe. Picture this, you're led into an arena or strapped to a stake. Instead of chains or ropes, the executioner approaches you with a tunic. Oh, good, you think. At least they're giving me something to wear. Then you notice it's dripping not with water, but with pitch, tar, and oil. This is the tunica molesta. Literally, annoying tunic, but more accurately, a highly flammable nightmare onesie. It was a garment soaked in combustible material, fitted snugly, and then set on fire while you were still very much alive and inside it. This wasn't just a method of execution. It was a public performance, most famously used under emperors like Nero, who turned executions into after-dinner entertainment. During his infamous garden parties, Nero would use the tunica molesta to light the grounds, human torches illuminating his twisted vision of Roman leisure. Who wore it? Arsonists, traitors, Christians, anyone deemed worthy of a particularly theatrical end. The flames clung to the body, melting skin, igniting hair, and searing lungs. There was no escape, no rolling to put it out. The tunic stuck to you. It burned with you, because Rome loved a good mythological reference. They sometimes modeled it after Hercules' poisoned shirt, a garment that caused the hero unbearable agony before his death. Rome didn't just kill you, they made it poetic. The real genius, if we can call it that, was in the psychology. You weren't just dying. You were on display, shrieking, flailing, engulfed in fire while crowds watched. It sent a message clearer than any stone inscription. This is what happens when you cross the empire. Some records even suggest that music was played during the burning. Nero reportedly plucked his lyre as the flames rose. Talk about a hot performance. So, if you ever complain that your clothes are uncomfortable or too tight, be glad they're not soaked in oil and part of a public execution ceremony. In Rome, fashion didn't just make a statement. It screamed, damnatio memoriae. When Rome deleted you from history, most Roman punishments ended with the body, but some reached further, into memory, into legacy, into obliteration. This is damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Rome's most haunting punishment of all. What's worse than death? Being forgotten on purpose. If you were an emperor who embarrassed the state, a general who rebelled, or a senator who fell too far from grace, Rome might not just kill you. They would erase you completely. Statues smashed or defaced. Inscriptions chiseled out. Portraits painted over. Your name struck from official documents, coins, and monuments. If you had achievements, they were reassigned. If you had supporters, they were silenced. The most devastating part? It worked. Many of the people subjected to damnatio memoriae were powerful, known, feared. Yet today, we don't even remember their names because Rome was that good at deletion. Whole reigns vanished into silence. It's historical vaporization. One of the most famous examples was Emperor Geta, brother of Caracalla. After Caracalla had him assassinated in their own mother's arms. No less, he didn't stop there. He ordered Geta's image removed from every mosaic, painting, and bust. Thousands of inscriptions were edited, his name scratched out by hand. In some surviving art, you can still see the ghost of Geta's figure. Awkward gaps, half faces, names partially scraped away. It's chilling, like history caught in the act of forgetting. But damnatio memoriae wasn't just about vengeance. It was about control. If Rome could rewrite the past, it could sculpt the future. If you could make it seem like someone never existed, then maybe their ideas didn't exist either. It was the empire's way of saying, you were never here, and if anyone says otherwise, they'll be next. There's something terrifyingly modern about it, too. We talk today about cancel culture, social erasure, reputations destroyed in hours, but Rome was doing it 2,000 years ago, just with chisels instead of tweets. So, as we close this strange journey through Rome's most bizarre punishments, remember this. The cruelest punishment wasn't fire or lions or ropes. It was the silence that followed. In ancient Rome, the worst thing that could happen to you was to be forgotten. In the early 1800s, the American landscape stretched endlessly westward. Wild, unknown, and whispering promises to those bold enough to chase them. The East, crowded with cities, factories, and increasingly worn-out farmland, had started to feel cramped and restrictive. The West, however, was the dream. A blank canvas with just enough danger to make the paint stick. It started as a whisper in taverns, in church pews, around dinner tables. Stories of open land, of rivers that shimmered like silver, of valleys that bloomed effortlessly. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had more than doubled the size of the young United States. Suddenly, there was space, unimaginable space, and it belonged to no one. Or so the government claimed. For many, the West was more than just a direction on a compass. It was a fresh start, a place where your name didn't carry your debts, where nobody asked where you were from, only what you could do with your hands. It called to dreamers and desperados alike. Farmers looking for new soil, widows seeking peace, and adventurers chasing legends spun from campfire tales. There were no highways, no guarantees, and no second chances. Every journey westward began with uncertainty. Would the wagon survive the mountains? Would the river freeze too soon? Would there be food on the other side? And yet, tens of thousands went. Entire families, with infants swaddled in flour sacks and grandmothers tucked between crates of salted pork, set off into the unknown. To go west was to gamble everything. But to stay behind felt like surrendering to a life of limitations. The frontier wasn't just a place on a map. It was a test of will, of grit, of the ability to carve order out of chaos using nothing but timber, steel, and raw hope. As the sun sank behind endless prairies and mountain ridges, casting long shadows on wagon wheels and weary faces, one thing was clear. America's story wasn't finished. It was being dragged slowly westward, one rickety mile at a time. Before the pioneers could brave the wild frontier, they had to build a vessel that would carry not just supplies, but their entire future. Enter the covered wagon, the backbone of the westward migration. It wasn't a stagecoach or fancy carriage. It was a wooden box on wheels, held together by sweat, hope, and iron nails. Most families didn't build wagons from scratch. They bought them or modified existing carts. The most famous type was the Conestoga wagon. But on the frontier, something smaller, lighter, and cheaper was needed. That became the prairie schooner, so named because its canvas top, billowing in the wind, resembled a ship sailing across grassy seas. But this ship didn't carry gold or jewels. It carried salted pork, flour, beans, cast iron pots, a spinning wheel, a Bible, and maybe one good quilt. Every inch was accounted for. Space was life and weight could kill you. A fully loaded wagon might hold up to 2,000 pounds. Any more, and the oxen pulling it would collapse long before you reached the Rockies. Horses were too delicate, mules too expensive. Oxen were the true engines of expansion. Slow, stubborn, but unbreakable. Families slept in the wagons, under them, or beside them. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. Despite what Hollywood suggests, people didn't ride inside all day. That would jostle bones and bruise backs. Most walked mile after mile, day after blistering day. Wagons weren't just transportation. They were survival pods. They held medicines, spare wagon tongues, gunpowder, and seeds. Some even carried baby chicks in boxes beneath the wagon bed to start a coop once the family settled. Yet, for all their practicality, wagons were also symbolic. They were hope on wheels. Once the oxen were yoked, once the wheels creaked into motion, there was no turning back. The house was sold. The land behind was gone. All that remained was the trail, the sky, and the belief that something better lay ahead. Every bump, every cracked axle, every muddy crossing, was one line written in the story of American expansion, carved not in ink, but in will ruts and willpower. Life on the trail was not the romantic adventure story some might imagine. It was long, grueling, and soaked in dust. Each day began before sunrise. Roosters weren't needed. The creak of leather harnesses and the groan of wagon wheels were alarm clocks enough. The average wagon train moved about 10 to 15 miles per day, depending on weather, terrain, and how many axles broke that morning. Over time, trails like the Oregon, Santa Fe, and California routes etched themselves into the earth, each lined with discarded belongings, broken wheels, and the graves of those who never made it west. Meals were simple, hearty, and endlessly repetitive. Coffee was a luxury, water a gamble. Streams could be clean or crawling with bacteria. Boiling it helped if you had the fuel and time. Otherwise, it was luck and prayer. Food was rationed. Salted meat, hardtack, dried beans, and sometimes wild game if someone could shoot straight. Wild onions and berries became treasured delicacies. Illness was the greatest killer on the trail. Cholera swept through camps like wildfire. It came from contaminated water and killed quickly, within hours. Dysentery, scurvy, and snake bites took others. There were no doctors, only home remedies and hope. Sometimes hope wasn't enough. Still, there were moments of joy. Children played with sticks and stones or skipped along the wagon's shadow. Weddings occasionally took place on the trail, as did births. Entire families were forged, not just by blood, but by shared hardship and dust-soaked camaraderie. At night, the wagons circled, not to fend off native attacks, as often mythologized, but for protection against thieves, animals, and the cold wind. Fires were lit, bread was baked on hot stones, and someone might pull out a fiddle. For a few hours, laughter and music pushed back the darkness. But rest was always brief. Tomorrow brought more walking, more wilderness, and fewer guarantees. Life on the trail was survival by routine. You learned to love your boots and hate your blisters. You learned to mourn quietly and move forward anyway. Because the land didn't wait for grief. It only moved west. After weeks or even months on the trail, the sight of trees, water, and flat land was enough to make a pioneer fall to their knees in gratitude. But celebration was short-lived, because once a family found their spot, the real work began. Homesteading wasn't glamorous. There were no pre-built homes waiting. No fences, no roads, just open land and the ticking clock of the seasons. The first priority was shelter, usually a one-room log cabin, barely large enough to hold the family that built it. Tools were limited, and every log had to be felled, trimmed, and hauled by hand or oxen. No chainsaws, no blueprints, just axes, grit, and guesswork. Most cabins had dirt floors, which turned to mud in the rain and froze solid in winter. Windows were often just holes covered with animal hide or greased paper to let in light while keeping out the worst of the cold. A chimney was a luxury. Many cabins started with simple holes in the roof to vent smoke. You coughed a lot. Inside, the family slept on piles of straw, furs, or corn husks. Beds were made from rope strung across wooden frames. If you were lucky, the gaps between logs were sealed with mud and moss to keep out the wind. If you weren't, the wind came in anyway. Then came the first winter, the season that tested every soul. If the family hadn't stored enough firewood or food, the months ahead could mean starvation or frostbite. Snowstorms might trap them inside for days. Coyotes howled in the dark. Wolves circled. But still, the frontier spirit endured. Families made candles from animal fat. Children learned to patch clothes and cook over open fires. They read from the Bible by firelight. They wrote letters home if there was a place to send them. Neighbors were few and far between, but when a new cabin appeared on the horizon, help was offered. A shared roof raising, a borrowed cow, a hot meal. Survival wasn't about toughness. It was about community. One family couldn't last, but 10 might. The first winter on the frontier wasn't just cold. It was a quiet crucible where dreams were either hardened into resolve or buried beneath the snow. On the American frontier, strength wasn't measured in muscle alone. It was measured in endurance, sacrifice, and quiet, relentless courage. No one embodied that more than frontier women. Forget the dainty damsels of dime novels. These women were warriors in aprons. The moment they stepped off the wagon, they became builders, farmers, midwives, butchers, doctors, and teachers, all rolled into one. If something needed doing, they did it because there was no one else. They woke before dawn to churn butter, bake bread, and milk cows, all before most men even rubbed their eyes. They planted gardens, preserved food, tended to livestock, and sewed everything the family wore, often from scratch. In times of sickness, they administered herbal remedies. In childbirth, they acted as midwives, sometimes for neighbors, sometimes for themselves alone. A woman on the frontier could kill a snake with a shovel in the morning and teach her children to read by afternoon. She might lose a child to fever and still have dinner on the table by sundown. Guns were no stranger to their hands, especially if their husbands were away or gone for good. Women defended the homestead with whatever was available. Rifles, axes, frying pans. There are stories of women fending off wolves, outlaws, and even raiders, all while holding a baby on one hip. Loneliness was the enemy, too. For some, the nearest neighbor might be miles away. Letters took weeks, even months, to arrive. The silence could be deafening. And yet, these women endured, knitting civilization from wilderness. One stitch, one lesson, one loaf at a time. Frontier women also formed the heart of the community. They organized barn raisings, cared for sick neighbors, and hosted Sunday gatherings when churches were still only blueprints. When towns finally sprang up, it was often the women who insisted on schools, libraries, and law. They weren't background characters in the story of the frontier. They were the backbone. Unseen, uncelebrated, overworked, and often overlooked, yet impossible to forget once you knew their strength. So, the next time you picture the Wild West, don't just think of cowboys on horses. Think of a woman, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled up, shotgun by the door, and cornbread in the oven. For every wagon that rolled westward, for every cabin raised and field plowed, there was already someone there. The American frontier wasn't empty. It was occupied by hundreds of indigenous nations who had called the land home for centuries, even millennia. From the Great Plains to the Pacific coast, the land was deeply woven with native life. Hunting grounds, sacred sites, migration paths, rivers filled with meaning. But to the U.S. government and to most pioneers, this wasn't seen as home. It was seen as potential. Thus began a long, painful unraveling of promises. The U.S. government signed treaty after treaty with native tribes, agreements that promised peace, land rights, and resources. But almost every one of these treaties was broken. As settlers poured westward, tribes were pushed back, then pushed again. Sometimes it was with ink, sometimes with fire and bullets. Entire nations were forced onto reservations, often barren and far from ancestral homes. The Cherokee, Sioux, Lakota, Comanche, and dozens more were made strangers in their own land. Some native groups tried diplomacy. Others resisted. Armed conflicts erupted: the Black Hawk War, the Sand Creek Massacre, Little Bighorn. But even when native warriors won a battle, they lost the war. The government simply kept coming. With troops, with railroads, with settlers hungry for space and willing to claim it at any cost. It wasn't just a land grab. It was cultural erasure. Children were taken from families, sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their languages. Sacred traditions were outlawed. Native identity was treated as something to be erased, civilized, or rewritten. Yet, through it all, indigenous peoples survived. Their languages were whispered in secret. Their songs were sung in defiance. Their stories passed down like living fire. The romantic image of the frontier often forgets this cost. But the truth remains. Westward expansion was not a triumph for all. For many, it was a slow, devastating march of loss. To understand the American frontier is to hold both truths at once: the resilience of pioneers and the tragedy of the people they displaced. History, like the land itself, holds more than one story. On the American frontier, law and order arrived late and sometimes not at all. In many newly settled towns, there were no police, no courthouses, and no jails. Justice was less about due process and more about who had the loudest voice, the fastest draw, or the biggest gang behind them. In short, the law on the frontier wore many faces, and not all of them were good guys. At first, it was the vigilantes who stepped in. Citizens' committees would form when a crime was committed. A horse stolen, a shop robbed, or worse. They held makeshift trials in saloons or under trees, and if guilt was assumed, punishment came fast. A bullet, a rope, or being run out of town with a warning and a bruised ego. Eventually, the towns grew, and with them came lawmen. Sheriffs, marshals, and deputies. Names like Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Wild Bill Hickok became. Some were courageous, others were corrupt. The majority walked a line between the two. Armed with a tin star and a pistol, they represented the fragile barrier between mayhem and order. Yet, outlaws arrived just as swiftly as lawmen did. The frontier acted as a magnet, drawing in wanderers, deserters, gamblers, and gunslingers, all hoping to disappear into the vast expanse. Figures like Billy the Kid, Jesse James, and Butch Cassidy didn't merely rob banks and trains. They ignited the public imagination. Newspapers transformed them into celebrated folk heroes, even as they left a string of casualties and broken safes in their wake. Frontier justice was notoriously inconsistent. A person could be executed for stealing a horse or be acquitted of murder if the jury found their story compelling. Bribes proved effective, as did intimidation. And sometimes, justice was simply a matter of revenge, embellished with a fancy hat. Even the courtroom, when one existed, often resembled a general store with a judge doubling as the hardware clerk. Despite the prevailing chaos, or perhaps fueled by it, frontier communities gradually established legal systems. Judges replaced vigilantes, and prisons took the place of hanging trees. Yet the legends never truly faded, and perhaps they never will, because on the edge of the known world, justice wasn't impartial. It was armed, covered in dust, and didn't offer second chances. Initially, the American frontier advanced at the pace of a wagon wheel. Slow, creaky, and dependent on the weather. However, by the mid to late 1800s, the stillness of the prairie was shattered by a novel sound, the steam whistle. The arrival of the railroad revolutionized everything. Suddenly, journeys that once required months by wagon could be completed in a matter of days. The Transcontinental Railroad, finished in 1869, forged a steel connection between east and west, transforming the frontier from a wilderness into a bustling corridor of commerce. Settlers poured in. Towns sprang up almost overnight alongside the new depots, and goods, ranging from stoves to sewing needles, arrived by train, ending the reliance on handmade or hoarded supplies. For pioneers, the railroad meant survival. It ensured that medicine could arrive before a fever turned fatal. It allowed crops to be sold beyond the immediate local market. It meant that letters, often delayed by weather and river crossings, could now travel in a matter of days. The frontier evolved from a high-stakes gamble into a more carefully calculated risk. But the railroad wasn't alone. Accompanying it were the telegraph wires, thin, humming strands of copper that stitched the country together with dots and dashes. The telegraph provided the frontier with something it had never possessed before: instant communication. A rancher in Wyoming could receive news of a presidential election within minutes. A sheriff could summon assistance from hundreds of miles away. Isolation, the primary fear of the early pioneer, was gradually fading, one beep at a time. The impact was significant. Economies grew. Government extended its reach. Law enforcement became faster and more efficient. However, not everyone welcomed these changes. Indigenous tribes viewed railroads and telegraph poles as intrusions, signs that the land they once roamed freely was now divided by wires and owned in parcels. Some resisted, sabotaging lines, derailing trains, but ultimately delaying the inevitable. Yet progress continued relentlessly. The iron horse was unstoppable. Towns that were bypassed by the railroad were left to wither. Others thrived, transforming into cities almost overnight. The wilderness was shrinking mile by mile, rail by rail. While the frontier spirit persisted, it was no longer isolated. It was plugged in, connected, and commercialized. The frontier remained untamed, but now it was powered by steam and signals. By the close of the 19th century, a profound transformation had occurred. The line that once distinguished wilderness from settlement, the famed frontier line, had blurred, faded, and ultimately disappeared. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau officially declared, "There can hardly be said to be a frontier line." In essence, the American frontier was closed. The great westward expansion was complete. The forests had been cleared. The railroads linked coast to coast. The buffalo population was nearly decimated. Indigenous tribes were confined to reservations. The land, once vast and mysterious, had been measured, mapped, and sold by the acre. But what did this signify? For some, it represented victory. The dream had been realized. A continent tamed. A nation stretching from sea to sea. For others, particularly native peoples and displaced communities, it meant loss, erasure, and a somber silence in place of their ancestral homelands. Yet, the closing of the frontier wasn't solely about geography. It was also about identity. The rugged individualism, the myth of the solitary pioneer, the campfire tales of heroism and hardship. These elements didn't vanish. They became the stuff of legend. Writers like Frederick Jackson Turner argued that the frontier had shaped the very essence of America. Its democracy, its resilience, its restlessness. The frontier instilled in Americans the ability to adapt, to survive, to rely on themselves and their neighbors. It gave rise to the cowboy, the log cabin president, the gold rush prospector, all iconic figures woven into the fabric of national mythology. But the reality was far more complex. The frontier was characterized by sweat, dirt, disease, and death. It was both brave and brutal, hopeful and unjust. It was full of contradictions, and its legacy remains a reflection of that tension. Today, the frontier persists not as a physical location, but as a state of mind, the idea that venturing into the unknown, whether it involves land, science, or space, defines what it means to be American. The wagons no longer roll. The cabins have become museums. The trails have been replaced by highways. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear echoes in the prairie wind, carried on stories passed down from those who dared to venture further. The American frontier didn't disappear. It became the foundation. Long before the invention of instruments, there was rhythm. The sound of a foot striking the earth, the clap of two hands, the thump of a heart within a quiet chest. Music didn't originate with wood, string, or bone. It began with the body. It began with breath. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before writing, agriculture, or architecture, early humans discovered something extraordinary in sound. In caves and on plains, around fires and in forests, they realized that certain movements, a stomp, a shout, a whistle, could evoke emotion, draw attention, or even soothe fear. Music, it seems, isn't a cultural invention. It's a biological imperative. Imagine a small band of hunter-gatherers huddled together in the flickering light of a fire. One begins to hum, a low, rising tone. Another claps in rhythm. A third starts to imitate bird calls. There are no words, only sound. And in that moment, they are no longer simply individuals struggling to survive. They are connected. They are human. Before the flute, before the drum, sound itself was sacred. Many anthropologists believe that early music might have stemmed from imitation, mimicking animal calls for hunting or echoing natural sounds to communicate across distances. But at some point, these sounds transcended mere utility and became expressive. A rhythm became more than a signal. It became a language of emotion. A hum transformed into a lullaby. A scream became a song. One theory suggests that music predates language, or at least evolved alongside it, that before we spoke, we sang. Infants, even today, respond more instinctively to tone and melody than to speech. Something about pitch, rhythm, and vibration is deeply ingrained within us. We didn't simply invent music, we remembered it. And perhaps most beautifully, these initial sounds weren't reserved for the elite or the talented. They were universal, a shared experience of early humans across continents. Music was created in Africa, Asia, and Europe, anywhere there were voices and hands and something to strike or shake. Before the first flute was carved from bone, before strings were stretched and drums were skinned, humans already understood that sound could stir the soul. And that was only the beginning. In the frigid conditions of Ice Age Europe, where mammoths roamed and glaciers sculpted the landscape, a silent revolution occurred, not with tools or fire, but with sound. Somewhere within a cave, an early human picked up a hollow bird bone, drilled a few holes into it and blew. Aton emerged, pure, haunting, intentional. This wasn't accidental. This was the genesis of the musical instrument. Archaeologists have unearthed bone flutes dating back over 40,000 years, making them some of the oldest known instruments on Earth. Discovered at sites like the Hohl Fels Cave in Germany, these flutes were fashioned from vulture wing bones or mammoth ivory, challenging materials to work with. However, their makers took the time to carve finger holes at precise intervals, enabling a range of notes. This precision reveals something profound. This wasn't random experimentation. It was music, structured, repeatable, crafted for expression. Why did they do it? Perhaps the sound mimicked birdsong, a connection to nature. Perhaps it accompanied rituals marking the passage from life to death or the changing of seasons. Or perhaps, just perhaps, someone created a flute simply to create beauty in the darkness. It's easy to view prehistoric humans as crude, solely focused on survival, but the flute suggests otherwise. It speaks of creativity, of a mind that looked at a bone and saw not food, but possibility. These instruments also hint at community. A flute played alone creates music, but in a group, it generates rhythm, harmony, and a shared experience. Around a fire, flutes might have joined voices, clapping, or drumming on logs and stones. The music would rise, echoing off the cave walls, creating the first concerts in human history. Consider this These Ice Age flutes predate the invention of agriculture, the wheel, and even writing. In the hierarchy of innovation, music appeared early, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. The flutes of the Ice Age weren't simply tools. They were expressions of joy, sorrow, mystery, and ritual. Fragile whispers from the distant past, still capable of moving us today. From bone and breath, humanity crafted melody. If the flute was our first voice, then the drum was our heartbeat. Long before cities, long before kings, there were circles of people gathered beneath the stars, clapping, stomping, and pounding rhythm into the ground. The drum wasn't invented in a single location. It emerged everywhere, across continents and cultures, as if the human body and the earth itself were yearning for synchronization. The earliest drums were likely simple. Stretched animal skin over a hollow log or clay pot. They were tools of rhythm, but also of ritual, communication, and power. A drumbeat could summon a god, lead an army, or gather a village. It wasn't just noise. It was a signal. In Africa, some of the oldest known drum traditions date back tens of thousands of years. There, drums became voices, instruments capable of speaking tonal languages, mimicking human phrases. In Siberia, shamans used drums to enter trances, their rhythms unlocking portals to the spirit world. In the Amazon, the sound of a water drum echoed through the jungle like thunder made by human hands. What made the drum so essential wasn't solely its sound, but its universality. You didn't need melody. You didn't need formal training. You simply needed to feel the beat. And feel it we did. Drums were used in birth ceremonies, funerals, weddings, harvests, and wars. Their pulse gave structure to chaos. A rhythm could bind a tribe together, unify a ritual, or prepare warriors for battle. The beat declared, "We are one." Even in early agriculture, drumming had a place. Farmers beat sticks to scare away birds. Harvest festivals featured dances led by drumbeats. Rhythm marked time, not just hours, but seasons, cycles, and transitions. Over time, drums evolved. People added carvings, paint, and spiritual symbols to their instruments. Drums weren't merely functional. They were sacred objects representing fertility, protection, or divine connection. And always, they connected us across language barriers, across generations, across worlds. In a world before clocks, electricity, or writing, rhythm was how we counted and how we felt. Drums brought sound to life. They made time tangible. And in their pounding, we discovered not only music, but also meaning. As humanity transitioned from caves to cities, music evolved from a survival ritual into a sophisticated art form. Nowhere was this more evident than in ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where rivers carved kingdoms and writing was born. Here, music began to acquire elegance. Among the temples and ziggurats, we find some of the earliest depictions of stringed instruments, harps and lyres, drawn on tablets, carved into walls, and even buried with kings. These weren't simple bone flutes crafted in secrecy. They were meticulously crafted, adorned with gold, silver, and lapis lazuli, their curves as graceful as their sound. The harp, in particular, became a symbol of refinement, religion, and royalty. In the city of Ur, dating back over 4,500 years, archaeologists discovered the famed bull-headed lyre buried beside the tomb of a noblewoman. Its body was inlaid with gold, and its face was crowned with a golden bull's head. It was not just an instrument but a myth rendered in wood and string. These early harps lacked frets or fingerboards. Strings were plucked by hand, and each tone was fixed. But what they lacked in flexibility, they compensated for with atmosphere. A Mesopotamian harp didn't shout like a drum. It whispered. Its notes lingered in the air like incense, sacred and dreamlike. In these cities, music became organized. Musicians were trained. Scales and intervals were recorded in cuneiform. The harp was employed in ceremonies, storytelling, and even astronomy as scholars charted the stars and correlated them to harmonies, believing that the heavens themselves sang in celestial intervals. The presence of harps in Mesopotamian burial sites reveals something profound. It was believed that music followed the soul beyond death. It wasn't merely entertainment. It was spiritual architecture, constructing bridges between worlds. And unlike the thunder of drums or the primal howl of flutes, harps introduced a new quality to music: intimacy, softness, thoughtfulness, and deliberation. For the first time, perhaps, sound wasn't solely for the gods or the tribe. It was for reflection. With stretched strings and a wooden frame, Mesopotamians gave voice to silence, and from that silence, the first melodies of civilization were born. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't simply an art form. It was a divine language. The Egyptians believed that music was a gift from the gods. According to myth, it was the goddess Bat, later merged with Hathor, the goddess of joy, fertility, and music, who first brought song into the world. Consequently, music transcended mere melody. It became ritual, identity, and spiritual architecture, resonating through temples, tombs, and marketplaces alike. Unlike the primal flutes of prehistory or the ceremonial harps of Mesopotamia, Egyptian music blended ritual precision with everyday life. Workers sang in rhythm as they built pyramids. Fishermen sang to the Nile. Priests performed hymns during sacred rites. Women played frame drums and rattles during childbirth and funerals, moments of beginning and end. The most iconic Egyptian instruments were harps, lutes, lyres, sistrums, and flutes. Harps evolved from simple, angular shapes into large, curved, decorative pieces with long, arched necks, symbols of status as much as sound. Some had as many as 22 strings, crafted with such elegance that they appear in tomb paintings, still vivid 3,000 years later. The sistrum, however, held a unique place. A type of rattle with metal rods that jingled when shaken. It was closely associated with goddess worship, particularly that of Hathor and Isis. The sound wasn't intended for amusement. It was meant to awaken the divine, to ward off evil, and to protect the soul during ceremonies. Musicians in Egypt weren't always commoners. Some were priests or priestesses serving in temples through music. Others were court musicians, entertaining pharaohs and foreign dignitaries with songs praising gods, kings, and legacy. Music also bridged worlds. In funerals, songs and chants guided the soul through the underworld. Tombs of the wealthy often included lyrics and even illustrations of instruments and musicians, as if to ensure that the departed would be accompanied by sound in the afterlife. For ancient Egyptians, music was eternal. It honored the gods, unified the people, and reminded them of the cosmic order. Marat, rhythm, wasn't chaos. It was the heartbeat of the universe. In Egypt, to make music was to echo the sacred. To the ancient Greeks, music wasn't just an art form. It was a science of the soul and of the universe itself. While other civilizations used music in ritual and celebration, the Greeks posed a deeper question. Why does sound move us? And their answer was found not only in poetry or philosophy but also in mathematics. Enter Pythagoras, the philosopher best known today for his theorem about triangles, but who also played a monumental role in the origins of music theory. According to legend, Pythagoras passed a blacksmith's shop and noticed something strange. The sound of hammer strikes varied depending on the size and weight of the hammers. This inspired an experiment with strings. He discovered that when a string was divided into simple ratios like 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, it produced consonant harmonious tones. This revelation birthed the idea of the harmony of the spheres, the belief that the cosmos itself operated on mathematical ratios and that music was an echo of universal order. Every plucked string wasn't simply a note. It was a mirror of the heavens. Greek instruments reflected this philosophy. The lyre, a small, harp-like instrument, became a symbol of civilization and education. Poets like Homer and Sappho were often depicted holding one. The aulos, a double reed pipe, provided the wild, emotive contrast, played in dramas, rituals, and sometimes in war. Music in Greece was deeply tied to ethics and character. The philosopher Plato believed that different musical modes could influence the soul, some inspiring courage, others promoting laziness or chaos. He advocated for strict musical education to shape ideal citizens. In his view, the wrong scale could be as dangerous as poor governance. But for the Greeks, music wasn't solely about entertainment. It was medicine, morality, and mathematical perfection vibrating through flesh and air. They laid the foundations for music theory, notation systems, and acoustics. Their understanding of intervals, scales, and harmony would resonate for centuries through Roman, medieval, and modern thought. In Greece, music became more than sound. It became a bridge between reason and emotion, between numbers and beauty, a place where the soul could both calculate and soar. If Greece gave music its philosophy, Rome gave it volume. In the Roman world, music was about function, form, and force. It accompanied festivals, religious ceremonies, gladiator games, and, most famously, the battlefield. Where the Greeks saw music as a bridge to the divine, the Romans saw it as a tool of order and empire. One of the most iconic instruments of Roman power was the cornu, a massive, curved brass horn shaped like a G, and often taller than the soldier who carried it. The cornu wasn't for melody. It was for command. Its blast signaled troop movements, battle charges, and retreat orders across noisy battlefields. Roman generals didn't simply shout. They orchestrated war. Alongside the cornu was the tuba, no relation to the modern tuba, a straight trumpet that could cut through the chaos of combat. Together, these instruments helped keep the Roman army, the most disciplined force in the world, moving in sync. Imagine tens of thousands of soldiers marching in time to the brassy, haunting calls of these ancient horns. It wasn't simply organization. It was psychological warfare. But Roman music wasn't solely military. In temples, tibii, double flutes, accompanied sacred rites. In arenas, music opened gladiator games, not unlike a modern national anthem before a sporting event. At banquets, lyres and hydraulices, an early water-powered pipe organ, created ambience for elite guests. Music flowed through Roman daily life like wine, structured, performative, and essential. They borrowed heavily from the Greeks but reworked everything to fit their own ethos. Where Greece emphasized individual expression and introspection, Rome emphasized public spectacle and control. Music was both entertainment and propaganda. And when Rome absorbed Egypt, Judea, Gaul, and beyond, it absorbed their sounds too. Roman music became a mosaic, blending African rhythms, Eastern melodies, and Mediterranean instruments into something vast and ever-evolving. Yet, unlike Greek philosophers, Roman thinkers wrote little about the theory of music. They played it, used it, marched to it, but rarely analyzed it. For Rome, sound was a means, not a mystery. In the end, Rome didn't refine music. It amplified it, until even the farthest provinces heard the beat of the empire's drums. While the West marched to the rhythms of empire, the East was exploring something else, the soul of sound. In ancient India, music was not merely an art form. It was a path to the divine. Rooted in the Vedas, some of the oldest sacred texts in existence, Indian music began as chant. The Samaveda, in particular, was a collection of hymns designed not only to be read but also to be sung. These chants followed intricate melodic patterns called saman, intended to elevate consciousness and harmonize the universe. As Indian civilization evolved, so did its instruments. The veena, an early stringed instrument, became associated with Sarasvati, the goddess of knowledge and the arts. The mridangam, a barrel-shaped drum, kept time during sacred performances. Every note, every rhythm, was tied to ragas and talas, melodic and rhythmic frameworks believed to evoke specific emotions, times of day, and even spiritual states. Music wasn't for entertainment. It was discipline, meditation, a way to balance inner energies and touch the eternal. Meanwhile, in ancient China, music was equally sacred but also political. The legendary Emperor Shun, one of China's mythical 5 emperors, was said to have harmonized the empire through music. Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, held that proper music led to moral behavior and social order. The right notes created harmony not only in the soul but also in the state. Instruments were carefully designed to reflect cosmic balance. The guqin, a 7-string zither, was played in solitude by scholars and sages. Its soft, meditative tones intended to reflect introspection and virtue. The shang, a mouth-blown reed instrument, symbolized unity through its many pipes working as one. The bianzhong, a set of bronze bells, was used in royal courts to represent hierarchy and ritual structure. Chinese music was tuned to precise mathematical intervals that matched natural cycles, aligning humanity with the heavens. In both India and China, music wasn't separate from life. It was life, a mirror of the cosmos, a code of discipline, a sacred pulse. While Rome used music to conquer, the East used it to commune with the divine, with nature, and with the self. From the thrum of bone flutes in Ice Age caves to the shimmering strings of Mesopotamia, from Egyptian sistrums that summoned gods to Chinese zither that calmed emperors, music has always been more than entertainment. It is a language without borders, a force that predates empires and outlasts them. But why has music endured when so many other inventions have faded? Because music speaks directly to something we can't fully explain, the emotional center of our being. It comforts, warns, excites, unites, and mourns. It's what a lullaby offers to a crying child, what a funeral drum conveys when words fall short, what a national anthem stirs before a battle or a game. Music is intuitive. A melody from the Andes can move someone in Africa. A drumbeat from a Polynesian island might feel familiar to someone in Scandinavia. It's not the notes we recognize, it's the feeling they carry. And music is flexible. It adapts, absorbs, and survives colonization, migration, war, and revolution. Instruments cross oceans, songs change languages, scales evolve, but the core remains. Rhythm, tone, and expression. Throughout history, we've used music to define identity. Tribes, nations, religions, and revolutions all have had their songs, but we've also used it to transcend identity, to collaborate, and to connect. Music doesn't require a shared tongue. It only requires ears and a heart. Listens. Modern science is now validating what ancient wisdom had already figured out. Music has the power to change our brain waves, lower stress levels, and bring back memories. People with Alzheimer's, even when they can't remember words anymore, still remember tunes. Soldiers use sound to deal with the pain of traumatic events. Babies react to gentle lullabies even before they can talk. We've transformed music into a type of therapy, a way to protest, a form of worship, a business, and just a part of life. In a world that's divided by different languages, beliefs, and locations, music is one thing that stays the same, a human mark that goes all the way back to our first ancestors, who played music on bird bones and made rhythms by hitting stones. No matter how much we progress in areas like AI, space travel, or technology, music helps us remember where we came from. It reminds us that we're not robots. We're creatures who feel, think, and dream. And as long as we're alive, we'll keep making music. Because way before we had stories to share, we had sound. And sound is what made us human.